The global economy is standing on the precipice of a significant transformation. Consider this single striking data point. More than 80% of global CEOs, according to a recent PwC survey, are concerned about geopolitical conflict impacting their business operations. This is not a fleeting anxiety. It is a fundamental recognition that the old rules of global commerce are being rewritten before our very eyes. The era of unchecked globalization, which defined the last 3 decades, is giving way to a new reality shaped by intense strategic competition. At the heart of this shift is the escalating rivalry between the United States and China, the world's 2 largest economies. Their contest for influence will define the next chapter of global history. This essay explores the concept of the 2026 reset, a term that captures a critical turning point in this economic reordering. We are not just witnessing minor adjustments to trade policy or temporary supply chain disruptions. Instead, we are seeing the foundational pillars of the global economic system being challenged and reshaped. The choices made by governments, corporations, and investors in the immediate years ahead will determine the structure of the world economy for a generation. This is not a distant academic debate. It is a present and urgent reality that demands our full attention. The stakes are incredibly high, and understanding the dynamics at play is essential for anyone leading a business or making policy. The designation of 2026 as a critical turning point is not arbitrary. It represents a confluence of policy cycles, investment timelines, political calendars that will culminate around that time. By then, many sweeping industrial policies and export controls enacted in the early 2020s will have reached a crucial stage. For example, the initial wave of investments from the U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, designed to onshore semiconductor manufacturing, will begin to yield tangible results with new fabrication plants coming online. These are not short-term projects. They are multi-year, multi-billion-dollar endeavors that alter the physical landscape of global production. Furthermore, political cycles in both the United States and China will have set new strategic directions. The U.S. will be midway through a presidential term, with a new national security strategy and budget priorities in place. These decisions will dictate the tone and intensity of its approach to China. Trade has always been the lifeblood of the global economy, but it is now also a primary instrument of geopolitical competition. The era when trade was viewed purely through the lens of economic efficiency is over. Today, it is increasingly seen as a matter of national security. The United States and China remain deeply intertwined trading partners, with hundreds of billions of dollars in goods flowing between them annually. However, the nature of this trade is changing dramatically. The U.S. has implemented targeted tariffs and stringent export controls, particularly on high-tech goods, in an effort to slow China's technological advancement and protect its own industrial base. These policies have created a new, complex web of regulations that businesses must navigate. The simple act of exporting a product now requires a much deeper level of due diligence. Companies must scrutinize their customer lists, understand the end use of their products, and stay constantly updated on evolving government restrictions. China, in response, has not been passive. It has retaliated with its own tariffs, established an unreliable entity list, and actively sought to strengthen trade relationships with Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America through its Belt and Road Initiative. Nowhere is the competition between the United States and China more intense than in the domain of technology. This is the central battleground of the 21st century. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology. These technologies power economies and military and intelligence capabilities. Washington and Beijing have made tech supremacy a top national priority, an escalating chip war. The United States is taking an aggressive stance to constrain China's access to high-end semiconductors. The Department of Commerce has issued sweeping export controls, restricting sales of advanced chips and the manufacturing equipment to Chinese entities. The U.S. has rallied key allies, including the Netherlands and Japan, to join these restrictions. The goal: slow China in AI development and supercomputing. China has responded with a massive, state-driven push for self-reliance. Beijing is pouring hundreds of billions into chips, funding research, subsidizing factories, and incentivizing homegrown alternatives. China still lags at the cutting edge, but it is closing gaps and dominating legacy chips used in cars, home appliances, and industrial machinery. For decades, the guiding principle of supply chain management was simple: optimize for the lowest possible cost. This led to the creation of long, complex, highly efficient global supply chains, with production concentrated in regions that offered the cheapest labor and manufacturing inputs. The COVID-19 pandemic, however, exposed the profound fragility of this system. When a single factory or port shut down, it sent shockwaves across the entire global economy, leading to shortages of medical masks, automobiles. This experience, combined with rising geopolitical tensions, has triggered a fundamental rethinking of supply chain strategy. The new watchword is resilience. Companies and governments are now prioritizing security of supply over pure cost efficiency. This has given rise to two major trends: reshoring and friendshoring. Friendshoring reorients supply chains to trusted allies to reduce the risk of weaponized interdependence. The US, Europe, and Japan are offering massive incentives to build critical goods, semiconductors, EV batteries, pharmaceuticals, at home or with allies. Section 6. Scenario A. The path of managed competition. In our first plausible future, the relationship between the United States and China evolves into a state of managed competition. This is not a return to the friendly engagement of the past, nor is it an all-out economic war. Instead, it is a tense but relatively stable equilibrium, where both sides recognize the dangers of unconstrained conflict and, work to establish clear guardrails and red lines. Leaders in Washington and Beijing maintain open lines of communication, even as they compete fiercely in strategic sectors. They tacitly agree on which areas are off-limits for cooperation and which can continue with enhanced scrutiny. Under managed competition, trade flows would not cease, but they would be rechanneled. High-tech trade in areas deemed critical to national security would be severely restricted. Advanced AI, quantum computing. However, trade in less sensitive areas would continue. Consumer goods, agriculture, other commercial products. Section 7. Scenario B. The second plausible future is one of competitive decoupling. The rivalry between the United States and China intensifies and spirals downward. Their economies separate much more deeply and broadly. The guardrails of managed competition fail to hold. A specific trigger, perhaps a crisis over Taiwan, perhaps a major cyber attack, or perhaps a severe economic dispute, escalates tensions to a point of no return. Trust evaporates completely. Washington and Beijing shift from competition to containment and confrontation. The small yard of restricted technologies expands across the economy. Economic blocks harden along geopolitical lines. The United States and its allies form a tightly integrated economic and technological bloc. China, Russia, and other aligned nations form a competing bloc. Global institutions like the World Trade Organization become largely irrelevant. Trade is governed by bilateral agreements and by regional agreements within these blocs. Supply chains are not just diversified, they are bifurcated. Companies must choose sides. Section 8. Implications. Navigating the new global landscape. Regardless of which scenario ultimately prevails, the trajectory toward a more contested and fragmented global economy is clear. The implications for businesses, governments, and consumers are far-reaching and demand immediate attention. For businesses, the most urgent task is to move from a mindset of efficiency to one of resilience. This begins with a complete and thorough mapping of their supply chains. It is no longer sufficient to know your direct supplier. You must know your supplier's supplier and even the one after that. Understanding every node in your value chain is the first step toward identifying hidden vulnerabilities. Based on this mapping, diversification becomes the next critical action. Relying on a single country or a single supplier for a critical component is now an unacceptable risk. Businesses must proactively build redundancy into their sourcing strategies, even if it means accepting slightly higher costs. Furthermore, investing in robust compliance systems is no longer optional. The landscape of sanctions, tariffs, and export controls is changing so rapidly that companies need real-time intelligence and dedicated expertise to avoid costly violations. Section 9. Conclusion. Practical takeaways for a world in flux. The world is undeniably at an inflection point. The era defined by the primacy of economic efficiency and frictionless globalization is behind us. The rivalry between the United States and China is the primary engine driving a fundamental reset of the global order. 2026 is emerging as a key milestone when these changes will become cemented. The contest is playing out across the critical domain of trade, technology, and supply chains, forcing a structural reordering of how goods, capital, and ideas move around the planet. The data points to a clear trend: a move away from a single, integrated global economy toward a more fragmented and politically contested landscape. Two broad paths lie before us. The path of managed competition offers tense but stable rivalry, contained by strategic guardrails. The path of competitive decoupling leads to a more fractured and dangerous world of hardened economic blocks. The old playbook is obsolete. Proactive adaptation is the only viable response to this new era of geopolitical risk. For businesses, map your entire supply chain. Diversify your suppliers across different regions. Invest heavily in compliance. Build resilience into your budget, even at the cost of short-term efficiency. For governments, use policy tools with precision. Invest in domestic competitiveness and workforce skills. Work with allies to establish clear rules of the road. Leaders must be guided by data and act with urgency now.